Among the large new rockets Amazon was counting on, only Europe has delivered. That single number resets the tech playbook. The key question is not what happened, but what changes next for operators and users. We will map trigger, incentive shift, and downstream impact before the close. Only one showed up on time. Let's start with the scale of this problem. Amazon has over 500 satellites sitting in warehouses waiting for rides to orbit. Each month they don't launch is a month competitors gain ground in the global broadband race. SpaceX's Starlink is already in orbit with tens of thousands of satellites. Amazon needed to move fast. Here's what Amazon was counting on. First, there was SpaceX's Starship, the massive reusable rocket designed to launch heavy payloads. Amazon signed up expecting regular Starship launches by 2024. SpaceX is still working on getting Starship to reach orbit reliably. We're now in 2026 and Starship remains in development. The timeline slipped by years. Second, there was Blue Origin's New Glenn rocket. Amazon's own founder Jeff Bezos owns Blue Origin, so this was supposed to be a sure thing. New Glenn was designed specifically for heavy lift. It's also still in development. No launches yet. The rocket that was supposed to be a guaranteed source of capacity has delivered nothing. Third was Arianespace's Ariane 6. This is the European heavy-lift rocket built by the European Space Agency and commercial partners. Here's where it gets interesting. Ariane 6 actually flew. It launched. It worked. While every other supplier Amazon was betting on missed their timeline, Europe's rocket showed up. Why does this matter for Amazon specifically? Kuiper is Amazon's answer to Starlink. It's not a nice-to-have side project. It's a multi-billion-dollar strategic bet that Amazon is using to compete in satellite internet, which is increasingly critical infrastructure. Every month without launches puts Amazon further behind SpaceX. The longer Kuiper sits on the ground, the more expensive it becomes to maintain, insure, and store. Opportunity cost is brutal in this business. But here's the second-order implication. This reveals something about rocket development that goes deeper than just Amazon's timeline. American heavy-lift rockets are struggling. Starship is revolutionary technology but it's unproven. New Glenn is ambitious but not yet flight-ready. Both represent the cutting edge of rocket design, which means both are riskier and slower to develop than expected. Meanwhile, Ariane 6 represents the traditional approach to rocket engineering. It's more conservative. It took longer to develop, but when the deadline came, it delivered. This creates an interesting dynamic in the commercial space market. For companies that need reliable, near-term launch capacity, like Amazon, the safe choice right now is Arianespace. The European rocket is available today. The American rockets promise more capability tomorrow, but tomorrow keeps moving. Who else feels this pressure? Any satellite company with inventory sitting around is watching this closely. Any investor funding space startups is noticing that launch availability is now the bottleneck, not satellite technology. And any nation tracking space independence, particularly Europe, is seeing validation that their rocket investments matter. What changes next? Amazon will have to make a decision. They can wait for Starship and New Glenn to mature and potentially get better economics and more capacity. Or they continue booking Ariane 6 launches to keep Kuiper on track. The smart move is probably both, diversify across proven and emerging options. But that's expensive. Ariane 6 launches are not cheap. Betting on multiple rockets hedges timeline risk but increases cost. There's also a broader policy angle here. The US space industry wants to be the leader in commercial space. But when American rockets miss timelines and European rockets deliver, it raises questions about execution and maturity in the American industrial base. The narrative around American space dominance just got a little more complicated. For anyone tracking the space economy, satellite internet, or Amazon's long-term competitive positioning, this matters. Launch capacity is now the constraint on the entire satellite internet race. And Europe, at least for the next 18 to 24 months, holds a significant advantage. This is worth watching because it will shape who gets to orbit first with large constellations, and in winner take most markets like satellite broadband, that advantage compounds fast. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next.